The Asian Games. It's one of the major tournaments in badminton, one that all Asian players want to win. It's right up there alongside the All England, the World Championships and the Olympic Games. And that isn't just because the Asian Games is recognised by the IOC as the second largest multi-sports event in the world, or that if a player can win it, then some of the benefits they receive from their country are incredibly lucrative. No, one of the biggest reasons why the Asian Games is held in such high regard is its long and incredibly rich history. A history that has spanned more than 6 decades, and it's a history littered with amazing stories, both good and bad. It's for that reason then that with the current Asian Games going on as I write this, I just had to look into it all, dig up those stories, and then do my best to give you that history in an informative and entertaining manner. Now, before we get into it, I must say that I have not included every single edition, and I'm sure there could very well be stories I've overlooked. I mean, it does span 61 years. If I have, then feel free to add them in the comments below. But I've done my best to highlight what I feel are the top stories, the most interesting ones. So, with that out of the way, let's get into it. Let's get into the history of badminton at the Asian Games. Badminton's origins at the Asian Games go all the way back to Tokyo in 1958, where it was held as a demonstration event. It was decided from that point on that badminton would become a full participation sport, with its first outing being the 1962 Games in Jakarta, Indonesia, with the badminton event held at the famous Istora Senayan. What's funny about badminton's debut at the Asian Games is that it foreshadowed what would happen exactly 30 years later at the Olympic Games, and that is that there was no mixed doubles event held in its inaugural edition. The reason for this is alluded to in a write-up on the Asian Games in a 1974 edition of the World Badminton magazine, wherein it said, when talking about the women's event, quote, "Never have been so popular as their counterpart for men. Take of that what you will." Indonesia took the majority of the titles, much to the delight of the home fans, although this joy was slightly marred by the controversy at the exclusion of some of the Asian Games Federation nations, most notably China, a decision which actually got Indonesia banned from the 1964 Olympics. By the 1966 Asian Games in Bangkok, Thailand, all Asian countries were back in the fold, including China. But contrary to what you now might be thinking, China didn't suddenly become the dominant force that you see today. No, at the next 2 editions in both 1966 and 1970, China had their worst outings as a nation in badminton, winning a grand total of 1 medal, which was a bronze in the men's team event. Now that might surprise you, but there was something else about this period that might surprise you even more, and that was the success of Thailand. These days, Thailand are one of badminton's top nations, and have amongst their players the world champion in men's singles, and former world champions in the women's singles and mixed doubles. And most people feel that Thailand's rise has only been the last decade, ever since Ratchanok Intanon won her world title in 2013. But no, back in the 1960s, Thailand were one of badminton's top nations, and they showed this at both the 1966 and 1970 Asian Games. In 1966 they won the men's team event and got silver in the women's team event. And in 1970, although they didn't win any gold, out of the 7 events they contested 4 of the finals. But as the 1970s progressed, Thailand's success regressed, and in their way came China, and with their emergence, created one of the Asian Games' most interesting stories. Before I get into that story, I want to say something else, and it's one of the reasons I feel makes the Asian Games so special and also unique in the badminton world. And that is that the Asian Games is the longest serving tournament where all Asians have competed against one another. Because you see, before 1981, the BWF as we know it today was split. You had the BWF, known as the IBF back then, and you also had the WBF, each running their own circuit, each even having their own world championships. Now, the reason for this split, I won't go into details. It is quite a messy story and one that requires its own video to do justice. But the crux of it is that before the 1980s, the only time players from China could compete against nations like Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. outside of just friendly matches was at the Asian Games. This, to me anyway, elevates the Asian Games in terms of importance, but it also allows us to see just how good some of the champions under the IBF actually were. Because, you see, there have always been doubts over some of the champions at tournaments like the All England in the years before the badminton world was united, with the most common statement being, well, if China could have played, then they wouldn't have won. And yes, whilst I can agree with that in some cases, I don't for all. I say that because the Asian Games champions from that period shows us. In 1974, Indonesian legends Tjun Tjun and Johan Mahudi won the All England Championships, which of course had no Chinese participation. But at the Asian Games that same year, with Chinese participation, they also took the title. With Tjun Tjun winning that 1974 Asian Games, it leans nicely back to that interesting story I alluded to earlier, the one I said was the most interesting in Asian Games history. What's so interesting is that at those exact same 1974 Asian Games, Tjun Tjun's sister also won gold in the women's doubles, but she wasn't playing for Indonesia, she was playing for China. Her name was Lang Shusha, more fondly and famously known these days as Chusha, a phenomenal player who actually went on to become an Indonesian citizen, coached the women's singles team for Indonesia for many years, and was responsible for their greatest ever period, producing world Olympic champions like Suzy Susanti. But yeah, back in 1974, both her and her brother Tjun Tjun won gold in the doubles events for two different nations. I don't think that has ever happened anywhere else, maybe even in all of sport. You have to admit it, that is a pretty wild story, and being the inquisitive person I am, I had to know more. Luckily for me, and you, my wife is great friends with Trisha, so I asked her about it, with my main question being, how did it feel to compete for a different nation to your own brother? Trisha simply responded that even though her brother was playing for a different country, as he was family, she of course supported him, as he did for her. There was no animosity or anything. They both trained to win, and that's all they both thought of. Trisha went on to have even more success at the 1978 Asian Games, winning the singles title and also delivering the winning point for China in the team event. Those 78 games drew the 70s to a close, and the 1980s were about to begin, a decade that was one of the most important in badminton history. But there was an Asian Games in the midst of it all that almost completely derailed it. In 1986, Korea was chosen to host the Asian Games for the first time, and this was a big deal. None more so than for the simple reason that this was seen as a test run for the Olympic Games, which Korea were to hold 2 years later in 1988. And Korea really wanted to make this a spectacle, spending over $3.1 billion to ensure that everything was perfect. From the opening ceremony, which saw a 100,000-seat stadium ram-packed, to all the sports being held in the best facilities, to even cleaning the Han River so thoroughly it seemed you could drink from it. But whilst these games were clearly very important to Korea, they were also important to badminton. This was because at the 1988 Olympics, badminton was to be held as a demonstration event, with the hopes of it becoming a full participation sport by 1992. So the 1986 Asian Games badminton event had to run as smoothly and perfectly as possible. And well, let's just say that didn't exactly happen. It all started in the men's team event semi-final when host Korea faced favourites Indonesia. During the second singles between Han Kuk-sung and Eddie Kurniawan, the Indonesian team launched a protest, claiming that the line judges should be from neutral countries, and that a number of bad line calls were going against them. The referee at the time dismissed any complaints because, quote, the rules specified Korean line judges, but the referee assured that proper vigilance would be applied. Indonesia subsequently lost 3-0 to Korea, and the issue wasn't taken further. However, that didn't stop it from rearing its ugly head once again, this time in the women's team event semi-final between China and Korea. Once again, a protest was made against the Korean line judging in the match between Hee Young-hwang and Lee Ling-wei. However, the Korean acted in a way that quelled any anger, as she voluntarily conceded the next point to Lee Ling-wei. This sort of sportsmanship, however, was not to be seen in the men's team event final between the same nations, Korea and China, in which the issue of bad line calls went up another notch. In almost a carbon copy of their semi-final match against Indonesia, Korea were leading as they went to the second singles, a match between the current world champion from China, Yang Yang, and once again Han Kuk-sung from Korea. And just like the semi-final match, there were a number of line calls going in favour of Han, with the most notable being 12-all in the first game. Play was delayed, the referee was called on, and similarly to before, nothing but vigilance on the lines was given. Han went on to win the match, and Korea finished out in the second men's doubles to win the men's team event, their first in Asian Games history. But back in those days, it was obligatory that the remaining matches must be played, even if they were dead rubbers. China, disgusted by the situation, simply refused and forfeited all remaining matches, continuing to launch complaints. It got so bad that a committee had to be assembled right there and then to discuss how this could be resolved. All of this led to a 90-minute delay for the award ceremony to happen. The outcome of the committee? You guessed it, vigilance. In fact, quote, very strict vigilance. However, even with this very strict vigilance, this wasn't the last of the bad line calls and protests from this Asian Games. In the individual event, in the quarter-finals of the men's singles, Ichuk Sugiyato faced Korean Sunbae Park. The match went to 3 games with both players absolutely exhausted. During this third game, at 8-6 in Ichuk's favour, yet again a bad line call caused a stir. The Indonesian team manager immediately launched a protest, claiming this was one of many bad line calls. But the protest was short-lived, not because the referee shut it down quickly, but because Ichuk had decided enough was enough, and even though he was leading 8-6 in an Asian Games quarter-final, he walked off and never returned, gifting the match to Sung. These 4 examples were the only ones reported on, but it seems that throughout these 86 Asian Games there was a lot of favouritism towards the home players, and whilst this certainly caused a controversy, ultimately it didn't hurt badminton's Olympic involvement, nor did it the players' relationships, as by the awards ceremony both the Chinese and Indonesian players cheered and applauded the Korean players as they received their medals. That's a pretty positive ending to what was a rather contentious Asian Games, but I'd like to add to it. Because amidst all that drama, Joo Bong put in a performance that will go down in history as likely the greatest performance ever. Joo Bong came away from those Asian Games with 3 gold medals, winning the team event, the men's doubles and the mixed doubles. He did the treble, the only player in history at the Asian Games to achieve such a feat. And not only that, but in the team event, he also led Korea at first men's singles, defeating all in front of him, including none other than Zhao Yanhua, the player who won the men's singles individual event in the final. Without doubt, this is the greatest Asian Games performance ever, likely one of the greatest at any badminton tournament ever. The Asian Games during the 1990s kind of followed on from the 1980s when it came to who won what, with the 3 big nations, China, Indonesia and Korea, taking the majority of medals. In fact, throughout the 80s and 90s, those 3 nations won every single gold medal on display, except for one. And it's that one exception that leads me nicely into the story of Kanako Yonekura's 1998 Women's Singles Championship win. A win which might just be the most surprising in all of Asian Games badminton history. To understand why I feel this way, first I must give you some context of the women's singles landscape leading into those 98 Asian Games. To put it simply, China dominated. The year previous at the 97 World Championships, China took all the medals on offer, including having 6 out of the 8 players in the quarterfinals. At the All England, they made it an all-Chinese final in both 1997 and 1998. In December of 98, when these Asian Games were held, China had 4 players inside the top 10 in the world, including the world number 1 and 3. And even at the team event for those 98 games, which precedes the individual, China stormed the competition, with their women's singles players not losing a single game. So, with all that in mind, you'd have had to have either been brave or stupid to bet against China winning the women's singles title. Well, that's exactly what happened, and when I first saw this, I was already pretty stunned. Then I looked into Kanako Yonekura more, and quite honestly, I couldn't quite believe it. Not only did Kanako somehow stop China from winning, but she actually defeated both of China's top 2 stars en route, defeating Ye Zhaoying in the quarters and Gong Sichao in the final. But what truly makes this result the most surprising is that this was Kanako's first ever tournament win. That's huge! And you might now be sitting there thinking, how come I have never really heard of her? What happened to Kanako? Well, whilst Kanako did have a pretty successful career that saw her play in 2 Olympics, that 1998 Asian Games win was by far her greatest achievement, as she only ever won one other BWF tournament, the Swedish Open in 2000. These 1998 Asian Games brought a close to the 20th century, one that was filled with an unconventional family story, controversy, and a true underdog story. And as we moved into the 21st century, well, we were about to see more of the same, starting with yet more line call controversy. In 2002, Korea once again played host to the Asian Games, this time in Busan. And as the men's team event reached its climax, there was a little bit of unease. Unease caused by the memories of the infamous 1986 Games, coupled with the fact that it was between Indonesia and Korea. This final did not go without its own fair share of controversy, with the biggest being in the opening match between Taufik Hidayat and Chong Sun-mo. There had been a number of questionable line calls in favour of Sean throughout the match, but at 12-9 to Sean in the second game, Taufik hits a cross-court smash that was clearly in. I mean, even with this low-res quality video, you can see there is clear space between the shuttle and the line. However, it gets called out, and quite rightly, Taufik is appalled. So appalled, in fact, he refused to carry on, demanding the referee come on and deal with the situation. What ensued was a delay of over 2 hours. But just like in 1986, nothing was changed, vigilance was applied, and on went the match. Taufik somehow won that second game, sending it to a decider. However, in that deciding game, yet another terrible call went against him, this time on the back line. Once again, you can clearly see how far this is out. You do not need Hawkeye to verify that one. The whole Indonesian team were in uproar, and quite rightly so. But once again, nothing could really be altered, other than putting an official in a chair next to the linesman. Ultimately though, as much as Taufik fought, he wasn't able to win, losing 17-16 in the third, which gave Korea a huge advantage, helping them to win the overall tie and their second men's team title. But once again, it was a win shrouded in controversy. In the individual competition, there was once again some worry building, as the men's singles semi-finals were both Korea versus Indonesia matches. Fearing the worst, the organisers, quote, adopted a cautious approach with both men's singles semi-finals. And they did this by putting 2 international match referees at strategic points behind linesmen. And this did seem to do the trick, as no more controversy was reported, and Taufik managed to avenge his team event final, saying after the match, "I was confident of winning the semi-final if I could get my shots going, and was not disturbed by any wrong line calls. I was determined to win this match and put the record straight." Taufik then managed to follow this up in the final, defeating Korea's other singles star Hyun Il, capping off a perfect revenge for the Indonesian, as well as claiming his first major individual title. These 2002 Asian Games provided quite an explosive start to the new century, and that wasn't about to slow down anytime soon, as come the next Asian Games in 2006, there was about to be plenty more crazy things happening, and once again, a number of them would be centred around Taufik Hidayat. The 2006 Asian Games in Doha. I'm going to lay out 3 stories from this one edition of the Asian Games, and of those 3, 2 involved Taufik Hidayat. By the time these Asian Games rolled around, Taufik had pretty much achieved all he had wanted. He'd won the Asian Games in 2002, won the Olympics in 2004, and finished the holy trinity of tournaments by winning the World Championships in 2005. And whilst Taufik was certainly a contender in 2006, there were question marks as to whether or not he could defend his Asian Games crown. The first of those happening even before the Games got underway, as there were talks of him being banned from competing after he walked out during a match at the Hong Kong Open earlier in the year. But other than that, with the recent scoring system changed to a point-per-rally system, people wondered whether that would give more aggressive players an advantage. And there were none more aggressive than Lin Dan, the world champion at the time, the leader of the new generation, and a player still on the rise. Whereas Taufik was seen as the older generation and a player entering his twilight years, an opinion it is reported that head Chinese coach Li Yongbo shared. This feeling led to the final question mark over Taufik's ability to defend his Asian Games crown. Did he have the true motivation to win again? Following the team event, it seemed these questions were somewhat answered. Within 2 days, Taufik lost to Lin Dan twice, once in the group stages and again in the semi-finals. It seemed even Lin Dan himself didn't feel his main rival in the individuals would be Taufik, but instead his compatriot Bao Chunlai, with Lin Dan saying this before the individuals started. "It is likely that my big rivals here will come from my teammates. I have a strong feeling that Bao Chunlai and I will meet in the final if both of us play well. Regardless of what Lin Dan said, when it came time to decide the winner of the individual, it was Lin Dan versus Taufik Hidayat. A huge match, not just because it was reigning world champion versus reigning Olympic champion, or new generation versus old generation, but because it had been widely reported that they didn't get along with one another, with Taufik saying he, quote, didn't like him, and that he isn't a good person off court. But by the time the last shuttle had been struck, amazingly it was Taufik who came out on top, defending his Asian Games crown and proving to everyone he could still deliver when it mattered, and also proving to Joo Bong he certainly wasn't over the hill.
He's done it! Oh, unbelievable! Match won by Taufik Hidayat. 21-15, 22-20. Well, that's interesting. Going across to Joo Bong and perhaps saying, past it, am I?
Now, I said at the start of this section that there were two stories centred around Taufik Hidayat at these 2006 Asian Games. And to begin to tell the second one, we must go back one match from that final with Lin Dan, to Taufik's semi-final with Lee Chong-wei. On the surface, this seems like any other match. There was nothing special about it. Taufik and Chong-wei had an entertaining match, with Taufik running out victorious in straight games. And that's how it was perceived for many years after. That was until 2 years ago in 2021 when Taufik shockingly revealed that he had been approached before his semi-final with Chong-wei at those 2006 Asian Games and was asked to throw the match, with him being offered 450 million rupiah, almost double that of which Indonesia would have paid him had he won gold. As you can probably work out, Taufik flat out refused, angrily telling the guy no. However, this news sent shockwaves around the badminton world, shocking Lee Chong-wei more than anyone. Lee Chong-wei says he had no idea this had happened, immediately wanting to clear the air with Taufik, and both agreed to not name the culprit, only saying he was a former Malaysian badminton player. This sort of revelation, however, did have some effect on the last story from those 2006 Asian Games, with that being Koo Kian Keat and Tan Boon Hong's out-of-nowhere win in the men's doubles, becoming Malaysia's first men's doubles Asian Games champion in 36 years. The revelations by Taufik Hidayat inevitably called into question this win and its merit, with the obvious question being, did they buy the win or actually earn it? Now, there has never been any reports of this, and honestly I don't think it happened. I believe Koo and Tan won the Asian Games on their own merit. And personally, I don't want to focus any more time on what ifs. Instead, I want to focus on the story of a pair who came out of absolute nowhere and destroyed the competition. Koo and Tan were a pair who, en route to winning those 2006 Asian Games, defeated the world champions Kai and Fu in the quarters, the future world Olympic champions Kido and Sethuan in the semis, and then defeated future world medalists in the final. Impressive to say the least, even more so when you look at the scorelines. It was a devastation, and what's even more impressive is when you consider that those Asian Games were only their second tournament together as a pair. You don't often see a pair explode onto the scene quite like that, winning one of badminton's biggest prizes that early. The 2006 Asian Games really was quite something, providing us with some interesting stories, great performances, and some memorable matches. But little did we know that at the next Asian Games in 2010, we were about to witness one of badminton's greatest matches. The 2010 Asian Games, held in Hangzhou, China, didn't have the controversy or off-court antics like 2006. What it did provide was some crazy matches, and there was none better than the men's singles final between eternal rivals Lin Dan and Lee Chong-wei. Lin Dan and Lee Chong-wei have had their fair share of amazing and memorable matches, with two of the most famous being their 2011 World Championships final and their 2012 Olympic final. But before either of those took place, they played another crazy final, the 2010 Asian Games final. I personally remember this match because at the time I was training at Milton Keynes under Kenneth Jonassen, and I can remember him coming in the following week and saying just how insane Lee Chong-wei and Lin Dan's Asian Games final was, and how he felt it might have just changed men's singles forever. Let me tell you, Kenneth is not the guy to heap praise easily, so by him saying something like this, he truly meant it. And I agree, this was not only a fantastic match between two legends, but it really did take men's singles in a whole new direction. As was often the case between these two, it was Lin Dan who won, finally claiming the Asian Games gold as own, ultimately completing his career Grand Slam. But really, this match was more than just who won gold. It was badminton on display, and that, everyone, was out of this world.
确不在。
哎呀，好球！难以置信的一个救球，
而且非常被动啊，这个球回过来的可以说反被动为主动。
林丹这是一个起死回生。
In 2014, the Asian Games returned to Korea for a third time, this time to be held in Incheon. Now, based on the stories I have told you already, I can imagine what you're thinking. What kind of controversy happened this time? Well, surprisingly, I couldn't find any, and this might play in no small part to the fact that the linesmen were not from Korea. But instead of controversy, I found two rather heartwarming stories. One was a sort of underdog story with an underlying redemption arc, and the other was an epic one last hurrah comeback story. I'm going to start with the underdog redemption story. This story starts 2 years before these Asian Games at the London Olympics in 2012. At these Olympics there was quite a huge scandal at the badminton event, one which involved 4 women's doubles pairs being accused of purposely throwing their matches so as to try and receive a preferable draw in the knockout stage. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this, rather than to say that ultimately all 4 pairs were disqualified from those Olympics, all 4 pairs received punishments from their associations, and the BWF looked at and revised how draws at tournaments with a round-robin stage are made and progressed. One of the pairs involved was an Indonesian pair, Gracia Polly and Meliana Jauhari. This London Games scandal was devastating for both players, but none more so than for Gracia Polly, who later admitted that she almost quit badminton because of it. But alongside having those thoughts of retiring, she also said to herself, quote, "I have to be strong enough." After having her ban lifted after 2 months and then a partner change to Nitya Krishinda Maheswari in early 2013, Gracia Polly had the Asian Games in 2014, where she wished to put the Olympic fiasco behind her. And heading into those Asian Games, it seems they were certainly contenders, as at the Chinese Taipei Open just 2 months before, they won, beating 2 of China's top pairs en route. And they followed this up with an OK World Championship run, reaching the quarter-finals. However, just 1 week before the Asian Games, disaster struck, as Nitya hurt her tailbone, which seriously put into question whether she could actually compete. But compete they did, as both players were desperate to travel and do their best. If this injury issue wasn't enough, after the team event when the individual draw was made, it seems they faced a huge uphill battle, as en route they'd have to likely face 4 pairs they'd never beaten before. But beat them they did. Wen Xing Cheng and Pei Chen Xi in the round of 16, Kakiiwa and Maeda in the quarter-finals, then in the semi-finals they defeated none other than the Olympic champions from 2 years previous, Qing Qian and Zhao Yunlei in an absolutely epic match, and then in the final they faced the Japanese pair of Masaki Matsutomo and Ayaka Takahashi, the world number 1s at the time and a pair who would go on to win the Olympics in Rio in 2016. In that final they played like a pair possessed, winning the title and becoming the first Indonesian women's doubles pair to win since 1978.
And there it is, Indonesia collapsed to the court in celebration because their tandem of Gracia Polly and Nitya Maheswari have just defeated the tournament #1 seeds to claim Asian Games gold here at the Gaeyang.
And with this result saw the completion of the redemption arc for Polly, although immediately after the final her thoughts moved to an even bigger goal, the Olympics, a goal she would eventually attain 7 years later in Tokyo, but that's a story for another time. Back to these 2014 Asian Games, the other story involves Korea, more specifically Hyun Il. In 2014, Hyun Il had already retired and been coached back by the Korean coaches a couple of times. Firstly for the Thomas Cup in 2010 as their men's singles department was thin, and then Lee ended up going to the London Olympics in 2012, after which Lee once again retired. However, in 2014 the Asian Games were to be held in Korea, and just like in 2010, Korea's men's singles department was thin. Korea also had a bit of a legacy to uphold, which was that every time they had held the Asian Games, they had won the men's team event. So, with both those things, Korea once again asked Hyun Il, who was now 34 years old, to return to the national setup to help Korea, and once again Hyun Il agreed. And very early on, this decision proved important, as in the quarterfinals against Japan, it was Hyun Il who stepped up at 3rd men's singles and guided Korea to victory. But it was in the final where Korea faced China that this story gets downright crazy. In this final, Korea went 2-0 up. Shang Won-ho defeated Chen Long, and Lee Yong-dae and Yu Yong-sung defeated Zhang Nang and Zhu Chen. China fired back though with their legendary team members, Lin Dan at second singles and Kaiyun and Fu Haifeng at second doubles. This meant it came down to the deciding singles. China had youth in the form of Gao Huan, and Korea had experience in the form of Hyun Il. And Hyun Il relied on all that experience as he rolled back the years, played pretty much flawlessly, and delivered the winning point, much to the absolute delight of the home fans in attendance.
Yes, there it is. It's gold for Korea. Gold for Korea. Hyun Il of South Korea wins this singles match and wins the gold medal.
There's something about watching a player achieve something amazing like this that is elevated when it's done in front of a home crowd, and the Korean crowd in Incheon certainly went nuts in 2014. But at the next Asian Games in 2018, it was about to get even crazier, as it was set to be held in the most passionate badminton country in the world, Indonesia, at the noisiest venue in world badminton, the Istora Senayan. And with what transpired, well, I don't think the Istora has ever been louder.
Kalau kau bilang tidak bisa diwujudkan karena mimpimu terlalu besar.
The 2018 Asian Games saw badminton come full circle, as the first ever official badminton event at the Asian Games in 1962 was also held in Jakarta, more specifically the Istora Senayan. With such a rich badminton history, it elevated these 2018 Asian Games and made them extra special. So, for an extra special event, there had to be some extra special achievements, right? Well, yes, that's exactly what happened. Here are just a few of them. Japan won the women's team event for the first time since 1970. It was an all-Indonesian men's doubles final, also for the first time since 1970. Anthony Ginting fought relentlessly in the team event, having to retire due to cramp in the final, only to come back in individual a couple of days later and defeat the favourite for gold, Kenta Momota, in the second round, and then go on to secure a bronze medal. And PV Sindhu solidified her status as a major tournament player as she reached the final of the women's singles, adding the Asian Games silver medal to her 2 world silver medals and Olympic silver medal. But whilst all 4 of those achievements are impressive, with the all-Indonesian men's doubles final and Anthony Ginting's exploits really revving up the crowd, there were 2 more that I want to highlight on their own, because one was truly historical, and the other got the crowd whipped into a frenzy the likes of which I've never seen before. In 2018, Tai Tzu-Ying was the clear world #1 in the women's singles, but for all her records and titles, when it came to major tournaments she always seemed to slip. In fact, at all the major tournaments like the World Championships and the Olympics, she hadn't even medalled. That was all to change at these Asian Games though, as she lived up to her top-seeded billing, winning the gold. But she didn't just win the whole tournament, she won it in one of the most devastating fashions ever, not losing a single game. In fact, she didn't even come close to losing a single game. What this win meant though was more than just a player finally delivering a major winning performance, but delivering a first for her country. This win was the first Asian Games gold in badminton for Chinese Taipei, a truly fantastic achievement by a truly fantastic player. Now, whilst Tai Tzu-Ying was top seed and favourite to win the women's singles, the winner of the men's singles, Jonathan Christie, was the complete opposite. Jonathan Christie was not only not even mentioned when people were predicting winners, but he was unseeded and found himself drawn against the top seed, Shi Yuqi, in the very first round. On top of this, by winning this Asian Games, he became the first men's singles winner in the modern era to not have won a World Championship or All England Championship before winning the Asian Games. For these reasons, Jonathan Christie's 2018 win could be ranked as one of the most surprising Asian Games wins ever. It certainly would be my #1 choice in the men's singles. And with his win also came not just the loudest crowd reaction ever, but possibly the wildest ever reaction by a commentator as well. I mean, just listen. Now, there's no doubting that this win was super special. And not just for Jonathan Christie himself, but for Indonesia as a nation. It capped off a very successful Asian Games for them, with a total of 8 medals, with 2 of those being gold. However, by the next Asian Games, it would be a completely different story. After a multitude of postponements, finally in September of 2023, the 2022 edition of the Asian Games got underway in Hangzhou, China. And it opened with a pretty cool thing for badminton, as Zheng Siwei, China's top mixed star, was chosen as one of the oath takers at the opening ceremony. At the badminton event, we saw many historical things happen, some being extremely positive and others not so. Let's start with those negatives. As you can probably tell if you've made it this far in the video, Indonesia has an incredibly rich history in badminton at the Asian Games. Not only did they host the first ever official badminton event in 1962, but over the years they have consistently been able to medal, heading into these 2022 Asian Games with a total of 99 medals. With Indonesia being only one away from 100 total medals, there were discussions about who could be the player to reach that milestone. But, as it turned out, no Indonesian players could, as by the end of the badminton event, Indonesia came away empty-handed. The first time this has happened to Indonesia in the history of the Asian Games. This was clearly a shock, sending shockwaves through the badminton community, with the Jakarta Post dubbing it a badminton nightmare. As well as a number of former top stars airing their opinions, with a number of them citing proper tournament planning, this result led to an apology from the head coach Ryan Meineke, evaluating the situation with a 16-point document he released, combined with a promise to turn it around for the Paris Olympics next year. But whilst these 2022 Asian Games will be one all Indonesian fans will want to forget, it is one Indian fans will remember forever, as they had their best ever medal haul since 1982 with a number of big firsts. The first of those came in the team event when the Indian men showed why they are the Thomas Cup champions, getting all the way to the final and pushing the host China all the way. In fact, some could argue that had they had their top men's singles star HS Pranoy playing in the final and not resting due to a back injury, India could have very well won. Regardless, this was still a great achievement, a first ever final for any Indian team at the Asian Games. In the individuals, HS Pranoy secured India their first bronze medal in the men's singles in 41 years, as he emulated Syed Modi, doing so with an injured back. But the stars of the Games for India were Satwik Sairaj Rankireddy and Chirag Shetty, who played superbly in the individual and took the gold. In doing so, they became India's first ever Asian Games gold medalists in badminton. A huge achievement, and one they were quite rightly heralded for on their return to India. Elsewhere at these Asian Games, there were a number of big results and magical moments. An Seong continued her simply ridiculous 2023 by not only winning the individual gold in the women's singles, replicating Bang Soo-hyun's win from 29 years before, doing so with what was later revealed to be a slightly torn tendon in her knee, but An Seong also helped Korea to the women's team event gold, where they whitewashed China in a very impressive display. And whilst on the subject of women's singles, this discipline also provides us with arguably the greatest surprise of this Asian Games. Japan had high hopes for gold in the women's singles with Akane Yamaguchi, the two-time world champion and world number 2. However, following her withdrawal in the team event due to a foot injury, it seemed Japan would come back empty-handed in the women's singles. Well, that's when Ahayo Ohori stepped up and delivered a medal-winning performance, knocking out none other than the reigning champion Tai Xing in the third round, and then defeating Indonesia's Tjun Tjun in the quarterfinals. Ahayo Ohori secured not just that medal for Japan, but also her first ever major medal. This really was a big surprise at these Asian Games, but elsewhere there were champions that once again delivered, as they so often do. Zheng Siwei and Wang Yachong, as well as Cheng Chen and Jai Fan, both defended their Asian Games crowns, with Zheng and Wang becoming the first Chinese mixed pair to do so, and Chen and Jia becoming only the second pair in women's doubles history to defend their crown, 57 years after it was last done. China also saw both their men's singles players reach the final, replicating the All England final from earlier in the year, with Li Shifeng also coming out on top again. However, for China it wasn't all great. Their men's doubles pairs failed to live up to expectations and didn't even reach the medal stage. And this performance brings up a very interesting fact about Chinese men's doubles at the Asian Games, and that is that they haven't had a men's doubles pair reach the final since 1990, when Li Yongbo and Tian Bingyi won. That's pretty remarkable when you consider that in the same time frame at the two other majors, the World Championships and Olympics, this is how many finalists China have had. I wonder whether China can rectify this at the next Asian Games. And talking of those next Asian Games, which are to be held in Aichi and Nagoya in Japan in 2026, that brings a close to this history of badminton at the Asian Games. As I hope you've come to realise, it's an incredibly rich history, absolutely littered with some pretty amazing stories, both good, bad, and at times ugly. Like I said at the start, I know I have probably overlooked some stories or glossed over some important moments or results. But that's where you can come in. Please do feel free to add any of those stories I may have missed in the comment section. And whilst you're at it, if you're not already, why don't you hit that subscribe button? Thanks everyone, and until next time, I'm Ben Beckman.